Hello, I'm Husho, and if you like what I do, please follow me on social media and consider supporting me, either on Patreon or by commissioning your own original artwork. It's been a while since my discussion of the problems with American Horror Story Apocalypse, and I've had some time to think over those points. I don't think the series is any better than my criticisms portrayed it as, but I would like to revisit the series, its overarching plot, and its characters to examine exactly what was so wrong with the season that should have been much, much better and more satisfying. I will say right from the start that I was wrong about some things in my critique, and the one I feel I should apologize for is being unkind to Cody Fern's acting ability. I have, since I made the previous video, seen him in other things, and I was honestly shocked to find that he is actually quite an able actor. And I know I was a little bitchy about him, but he is able and he is actually very pretty. That is, when he's not in American Horror Story. American Horror Story's crew did not flatter him, even though they should have. It's through his own natural good looks that he ever looked good at all on the screen. And as far as acting, upon my rewatch of the series, he didn't have good material. No one had good material. Sometimes the direction would have a character change motivations and emotions completely in the middle of a scene. See The Warlocks for a great example of this. Cody Fern tried hard, but as with Kathy Bates or any otherwise good actor, you can't give an actor a huge amount of terrible material and leave them lacking direction, then expect them to just pull a great performance from their ass. Even with a great veteran actor like Angela Bassett, some actors do well just to portray themselves playing the role if they're not given any direction otherwise. It can work just fine, but it really shows if you know the actor. Meryl Streep is the same way. In any case, apologies to Cody Fern and anyone else I didn't give enough credit for doing the best they could with a terrible script, inconsistent writing, and very lacking direction. On retrospect, it's never more obvious than it got with the characters Mutt and Jeff, right down to their names. Even actors I know are good couldn't manage to make those dumpster fire characters anything but cartoonish throwaway jokes. And speaking of cartoonish throwaway jokes and dumpster fires, did half of Apocalypse's writing staff think they were composing a dark comedy? If it had been consistently that tone throughout, the bon mots and one-liners might have actually come off as amusing, but since it wasn't like that, they more often just stood out as character-destroying and the opposite of funny. If you don't set the tone as trying for comedy, it makes someone come off as a real asshole when, for example, they could bring someone back to life but just don't because they can't be bothered at the moment. But now, to the real matter I'm here to discuss, American Horror Story Apocalypse. Finally, the great crossover season that Ryan Murphy has talked about for over half a decade. Crossover events are a very common thing to anyone who has ever read comic books for any length of time. They're typically disappointing affairs nowadays, and they've certainly had their moment of popularity, but back in the day they used to be pretty exciting. And it's not just comic books. Other media also have enjoyed the crossover, most notably long-running series like Super Robot Wars and even franchise-specific media like the many games featuring characters from distinct universes and timelines. Crossovers are not very hard to do, but they do tend to be hard to do well if you're ambitious. It's simple enough to make a perfunctory story, toss in all the characters people like, and sell it to them. It doesn't need to be the best thing ever, it just needs to have a lot of fun moments for fans and celebrate the characters involved in it. So in this way, I can see the appeal of Apocalypse, and I can understand why some people who watched it really enjoyed it. They basically only needed more time with characters they love, and they got that. And I'm glad for them if that's all they needed to have a good time. Obviously, I'm not the same way, but it is nice if someone can watch something like this and have that be their takeaway. The thing is, looking back on the previous season, Coven, it wasn't a very good or very coherent season. It just wasn't together enough, and by the end it was a chaotic train wreck. As had become the pattern then, the first few episodes tended to be good in a season, but by the end the show bore little to no resemblance of what it was supposed to be. I've compared it to a film with multiple sequels which by the end don't resemble the original film. As a pop culture program, American Horror Story made the right move by, being inspired by things like the X-Men and the Tomorrow People. I have multiple times made the comparison between Coven and X-Men, and I stand by my description of Coven as X-Men but with witches, because that's fundamentally what it was. But in typical American Horror Story fashion, it decided to complicate that with an overreaching story pitting women versus men, despite having little reason to, and prominent characters on both sides not fitting the narrow stereotype they clearly wanted to portray, and different racial backgrounds against each other. which similarly did not work for a number of reasons. Here's the thing. When you have an X-Men situation, you have all the us versus them you need with the group that is like the X-Men. If you are persecuted by an ignorant society, you have all the story that you need right there. And you could mention Magneto and Professor Xavier both being mutants and having teams that represent their ideologies, but you already had that with Cordelia and Fiona, despite Cordelia not really bothering to do anything until literally the last minute, and long after anything actually mattered. You didn't need to add the witch hunters to the mix because all they did was provide a straw man men are violent punching bag, which apparently Ryan Murphy didn't realize made Cordelia even more unsympathetic and less of a character due to her utter failure as a headmistress, mentor, and guardian. Not that the women of Coven fared much better, with nearly all of the characters doing similarly awful things to each other. If witches were in danger of dying out, it was more because they couldn't get past their individual damage and stop targeting each other. So for years, Coven was the high point in ratings and interest in American Horror Story. It wasn't a great season of television, but it did have especially memorable moments and largely likable characters. After a complete garbage fire of a finale, though, audiences strongly wished for the story to be fixed and to see characters they enjoyed once again. Showrunner Murphy promised to return to the Coven for years, and he never delivered until Season 8, Apocalypse. It was due to a number of reasons, and I'm 100% sure that the low ratings and general dislike of the abysmal cult season made him desperate to try and recover the show. There's a lot of discussion about behind the scenes, and I can't state much about that with any authority, but I can say that Cult was the lowest rated and worst regarded season of the entire series, and one in a sequence of progressively poorer and poorer performing seasons. Even though the show was technically renewed before Apocalypse, I can't imagine anyone was very optimistic about it until the witches were revealed to be returning. I honestly thought the show would be quietly cancelled and no one would care much, since Cult was deeply unpopular, and American Horror Story has always only had kind of a niche fandom. Enter Apocalypse, promoted to the hilt with all kinds of callbacks to every previous season, even though most of them either don't appear in any relevant way or are simply implied in the actual series. The promos, as usual, were spectacular and exciting, getting the audience more and more worked up and eager to see not only the return of the most popular characters in the whole program, but also a new story with the highest stakes of the entire run. And then we got there. And they fucked it up in the first 5 minutes of the first episode by having the bombs drop right away. No suspense or building of tension for American Horror Story. We shouldn't have been surprised, though. Of course this is how American Horror Story's world ends, as stupidly and clumsily as possible. It's also not a world built up to be anything worth saving, and it's no different after the bombs than before. It's a bunch of would-be tin-pot dictators wanting to control a couple of sensible people and a larger group of idiots. And we spend 3 completely superfluous episodes with these morons, during which little really makes any sense, and there's never any tension because none of the characters matter at this point, and none of them are relevant to anything. Only after that does the story actually begin, and it's backbuilt almost immediately, making a majority of the season a flashback, which is an extremely amateur writing mistake. It doesn't build tension, even if there's some modicum of mystery to what happened in the interim the audience doesn't know. It tends more to frustrate an audience because they're made to wait, in this case for weeks on end, to pick up the story where it left off in flashbacks, so that by the time they're actually back to the story progressing in linear present time, they've probably either forgotten where they left off, or they've kept it in mind and not paid attention to the story built in flashback. Either way, it's a bad choice as a writer, especially in television, and it's terrible in Apocalypse because there are actually several episodes that are more or less self-contained, and thus largely unessential to the building of the story. Which is a shame because, as I've said before, I tend to prefer self-contained episodes of any series, since I don't always want to have to watch an entire season all over again. But if you really get down to it, you could watch the last episode and really miss nothing much about the season and its story. Virtually everything else is just a series of retcons and backbuilding. The majority of the season is flashbacks, which is absolutely unacceptable and, as I said before, incredibly amateurish. The callbacks it has to previous series are mainly to Murder House, with the obvious Coven references despite seemingly no one on the production staff having refreshed their memory of what actually happened in Coven. Murder House is similarly poorly addressed, with one largely self-contained episode touching upon it, badly, and a half-assed resolution of the entire plot by 2 people. Apparently, if a witch had been involved with the first season, it would have been done in a couple of episodes. I've covered this in my video of problems with Apocalypse, and I'll just briefly mention it here, but it's tremendously disrespectful to the characters and their struggles and story to just tie it up in the way Apocalypse did. Tate and Violet were not right for each other. Tate did terrible things that should not be brushed under the rug, and furthermore, he was a complex character that the Apocalypse episode dumbs down to a one-trick pony who was, completely against character, just an anguished teen. And even though the Harmons were not particularly exciting people, they also weren't as stupid as the episode paints them and actually tended to communicate between themselves even more after they became ghosts. Why introduce artificial drama when it's not needed and you don't have time to develop it? The episode could have, and should have, dealt with Moira's lingering need for resolution and to move on. That was the most beautiful part of it, and it was actually well done. Why attempt to address things like Tate and Violet when we probably would have benefited more from not seeing them at all, much less seeing them implausibly together again? We didn't even need to see Constance. As much as I love Jessica Lange and have wished for her return to the show, did it have to be as the most interesting character from Murder House, but written completely inconsistent with her appearance in Murder House? When we last saw Constance, she was ecstatic at the prospect of not only having the chance to be a mother again, but to be the mother of the Antichrist. Her impassioned speech, delivered in a way only Jessica Lange can, reflected tremendous pride and rapturous joy at being given this second chance at life and motherhood. At the end of Murder House, she was barely displeased with Michael's murder of another babysitter. In Apocalypse, she's moved to throw him out because of some imagined difference as he's aged. It's cool that she's kind of a badass and very defiant of a real danger to her soul itself, but it's not Constance Langdon we're seeing there. To have her wasted on an episode when we could have had Fiona return is one of the greatest disappointments that Apocalypse served up to us. Other than Moira, we should have dealt only with Ben and Vivian. If the production couldn't get both, just one would have done fine. There's no piece of information that couldn't have been found out from them. There's certainly no reason we needed to go to the neighbor, who is incidentally at least 200% A-OK with raising the Antichrist and who, for some reason, decided to commit suicide, completely out of character, yet do it on the grounds of a house she knew would keep her around as a ghost until the end of time. But honestly, it's as simple as this. Constance's story was done. It was finished, complete, and didn't need to be revisited. Of all the characters Jessica Lange played over the years, Constance was one we never needed to see again. Her story had reached its logical end, and writing her nearly 10 years after the fact, and, as I pointed out, without apparently going back to consult the scripts from the season in which she appeared, acting almost completely out of character to the extent that if she hadn't been played by the same actress, she'd be unrecognizable, was not fan service to anyone who had watched long enough for it to be. And to get to the matter of someone returning that we thought was irretrievable, why on earth would Cordelia try to get Marie back instead of Fiona? Marie was an enemy to the witches for pretty much the whole of Coven, only teaming up with them once she had nothing else to do. Fiona at least was an effortlessly capable witch, even without the power of the Supreme. Voodoo also was shown, at least in the Apocalypse and Coven world, to be pretty ineffectual. So why would you want a voodoo priestess? It was clearly done to punish Dinah, who did deserve it, but there's no reason why they couldn't have punished her and traded her for Fiona. Even if Fiona couldn't have beaten Michael outright, she would have slowed him down a lot more effectively, since witchcraft was the only thing shown, even in non-supreme witches, that Michael actually feared and would actually hurt him. And there's that whole thing about Cordelia maybe wanting something of a second chance with her mother, since they were only able to reconcile with each other at practically the very end. Why not have a moment to connect with her again, and give her the opportunity to do something really spectacular? Because Cordelia is the villain of the piece. She obviously made the decision unilaterally to go public with witches. I'll spare you yet again mentioning the double standard between her and Madison, but I'll add to that the fact that it's clear Murphy had no idea he was going in the direction he did for Apocalypse, and he didn't even try and fit it in with Coven. As you know, I had a problem with Coven's finale, especially Cordelia going public with witches, which was pretty much celebrated, despite Madison's threat of doing the same thing right before that being played as if it were the worst thing ever. It is made much clearer in Apocalypse that she didn't consult anyone before doing it, which makes me wonder how she did it so thoroughly and effectively. She doesn't exactly show herself to be tremendously connected or resourceful, and if the warlocks exist somehow both under her executive domain and yet distinctly self-governing, it only logically flows that she would have been expected to consult with their council, to say nothing of the Witches' Council at the time that no longer existed, before making any such decision that would also affect their lives. It's also worth pointing out that the warlocks are clearly much better at locating people than Cordelia or any of the witches are, and her going out of her way to make enemies of the warlocks yet again directly causes the death and suffering of numerous people. But it's specifically stated that the Warlocks' Council of the Hawthorne School are able to call an emergency session that Cordelia and other senior witches are obliged to attend. If that's the case, how is it Cordelia was even allowed to go public with witches? Presumably she would require the affirmative vote from both the Witches' Council and the Warlocks' Council, and possibly others that Ryan Murphy hasn't thought of yet. Or is it just that she doesn't actually care about any of the councils, but somehow feels obligated to adhere to their procedure, though only when it doesn't matter? She seems to think that all power is in her hands when she sits there for what looks like about 5 minutes, then decides to leave again, after an extensive amount of travel taking hours. We don't see any evidence of the Witches' Council, which you'd think would also be required to be present at such a major emergency council, but they are completely absent. Are we supposed to believe that the council consists of Cordelia, Myrtle, and Zoe? Because Myrtle was out of the picture for years. Zoe, as always, is a placeholder, and Cordelia is the supreme, which, if we approach the issue ethically, should probably recuse herself, since she just repeatedly shows what a tremendous personal bias she has on the issue, while Zoe struggles to remind people that she really does exist. No, really, that's why they gave her basically no lines. Madison mentions that the Witches' Council considers her, and I quote, expendable in the Murder House episode, but that only comes off as a comment of someone who's been out of touch for too long. We never hear the council referred to before that point, and we see no evidence that there is one in existence, since a council would logically consist of people not all from one tiny corner of the world, and Madison was given her mission by Cordelia, directly and alone. It was hilarious to see Zoe pull a face at Cordelia pouncing on yet another drama trigger, though, just as it was hilarious when she fainted at the end of the episode, and Madison just acted like, yep, Delia's still a fucking drama queen, bravo, bitch. Then again, pretty much everyone starts to react that way to her. Genuine praise for having Behold read her, even if only a little, during their meeting. If she hadn't set such a poor example and actually cultivated and maintained good relations with the Warlocks, most, if not all, of the problems of the story would have been avoided. It's stated unequivocally that Cordelia's outing of the magic community was directly responsible for the destruction of the Hawthorne School and its relocation underground. Because I have to point it out every time, a lot of fuss was made over Madison's threat to go public with witches, but everyone seemed okay with Cordelia doing it, and, perhaps most importantly, the script seemed okay with it, even regarding it as an overwhelmingly positive thing. But it was not. And as we join the story of Apocalypse, we see what that led to at even a fairly low level. It stated that they had angry neighbors, which seems remarkably pissant for the destruction of a school. Moreover, her relationship with the Warlocks is remarkably bad from the start. They mostly hate and resent her, and she has done absolutely nothing to remedy that. It's her responsibility as the leader, the supreme, the chief authority among the magic community, to unite and lead them. She is remarkably poor at her job. She's self-important as usual, even after she has her apocalyptic vision, and even states very clearly that what she does next could avert the catastrophe. So we're clear that she knows her actions have ramifications, and at this point we're supposed to think she's perhaps wised up a bit about her sexist attitudes. Not so, we find out, because aside from this immediately subsequent decision, she makes and continues to make progressively worse and more idiotic choices. In fact, it's here, quite early on in the story, that we see her essentially bringing every bad thing that happened on herself and those around her. In fact, this very decision she makes just further expands upon her intent of being a total asshole to Michael and everyone at the Hawthorne School. She is upset about the test of the 7 Wonders, and in particular the test of Descensum, during which a potential Supreme must project themselves into essentially hell. And yes, I am aware that they tried to pronounce it slightly different on the show, but this is how you should properly pronounce it. Add to that the fact that people tended to pronounce it differently anyway, well, it doesn't really matter. In any case, she is well aware that not only was Madison in there, and she had made no effort whatsoever to free her, which is lampshaded by a throwaway joke that is not even slightly funny, but that she herself could not free Queenie from the, in her words, hell mouth where she was trapped. Is it not suspicious to anyone else that she, for some reason, got totally okay with the test in its entirety and didn't just say, "It's cool, guys. Clearly he's already accomplished the descensum thing not once but twice, and we don't need to go over that again." And furthermore, she's changing the established rules of centuries and demanding he go to find Misty Day, who was her responsibility and who was mentioned as one of her greatest failures, but when challenged by Ariel again, as she does with everyone, instead of actually defending her decision, she just threatens and bullies him, which he curiously and conspicuously doesn't get to answer before the scene is forcibly changed by Michael being surprisingly accommodating. And here I'm going to take a moment for an aside. The Warlock School's curtain wall technology seems only to serve as a convenient eavesdropping method for everyone who uses it, because it is then immediately after used to reveal the person who is listening in so that they can do something dramatic. Speaking pragmatically, based on every time the curtain appeared, it essentially allowed anyone to remain completely hidden until their shocking reveal. Why would they ever have something like that? And more importantly, why would they ever discuss sensitive matters in a place they know they'll be overheard, but not able to know who's listening in? I can forgive Cordelia not knowing it was so easy to listen to any conversation held there, but why do Ariel and Baldwin discuss extremely sensitive business and keep unbelievably dangerous items in this completely unsecured space? Even if this weren't such a dire situation, they run a school. Not every student is going to be good or well behaved. And most people who have ever been students will agree, students are always going to try and listen in on things that may be relevant to them. Staff talking amongst staff will always say more to each other than they would tell the students. So even speaking purely logically and practically, this is possibly the most horrible piece of decor that has ever existed in all of time. But back to Cordelia and her relations with the Hawthorne School. Even when we find out that she was attempting to play them to get what she wanted, it's naive of everyone around her, and also makes her come off as even more of an asshole and an incompetent. She couldn't even throw her supreme weight around and hand-wave the parts that he'd obviously completed? Bullshit! And she just thought that goading Ariel on and being an absolute bigoted piece of shit was permissible and acceptable instead? You will catch more bees with honey than you will with vinegar. You know that saying? And keep your friends close and your enemies closer. It's basically the same point which even decent strategists and moderately intelligent leaders know. I might add, Cordelia even paraphrases it after Michael's return from hell with Misty, but her claim is absolute nonsense. She claims she always knew he was bad news and wanted to see how powerful he was, but her actions before even meeting Michael made it clear that she had no idea how powerful he was and had no intention of allowing any penis-haver to ever ascend to her ill-gotten position. Ultimately, all Cordelia's actions do is play her hand far too early, making the story predictable and yet still inane, plus it sets all of her coven, all of her allies, and everyone she cares about, who trust in her for protection and guidance, up to fail, suffer, and die at the hands of the powerful enemies she makes. Which I must point out again, was completely needless. From the writing, we're supposed to believe that Ariel Augustus is a power madman to whom title and some illusionary power hierarchy are supremely important. However, the performance, and the lines as they're written, paint him as someone who tries his best to be a good and strong leader, unlike Cordelia, who bebops around without ever taking her position seriously, who is misled by the promise of power from people who are treating him well, unlike Cordelia, who goes out of her way to further play upon the very real discrimination she caused to him and endanger him and his entire student body. Who are, it must be added, never calls for concern to any of the witches. Not once do any of them ever give so much as a single copper-coated fuck about any of the students at the school, all of whom are only young people being influenced by their leaders and surroundings. The only time anything is expressed of concern about them, it's after they're all massacred and spectacularly too late. The thing is, even if we take Ariel as a mwahahaing bad guy from the start, Cordelia is at the very least an idiot, and a hateful one that makes it impossible to sympathize with her, because she's such a bigoted dickhole. It's difficult to see her side of things when she behaves exactly as Ariel's opinion of her shows, a weak, scared person. We don't come away from the scene with the concept that he knew Fiona particularly well, because she never showed herself to be weak or scared particularly, but we can handwave that as something said for impact. which it did have. Cordelia's answer to that accusation, however, only reinforces the fact that she is not only terrified but horribly weak. As I pointed out in my Problem Points of Apocalypse video, bullying does not show strength. It is not empowering. It does not make a character better, superior in any way, or stronger. All it means is that they have the threat of violence to hold over another person, which instead tends to make a character clearly weaker. If someone has to resort to implicit violence, even threatening someone very explicitly with murdering them, after you cause real violence and millions of dollars worth of damage to them in the past, to call someone a bully at that point seems kind of an understatement. That person is a monster, and irredeemable. They certainly are not in any way sympathetic or possible to identify with, regardless of anything else in their story. Though I will concede, it's fair to point out that the whole warlock concept and their school were only invented for Apocalypse and never even entertained before, which is obvious from the presence of a male witch played by the inimitable Leslie Jordan as part of the Witches' Council in Coven. And before anyone tries to conflate someone being obviously flaming gay as somehow feminine, no, that's not how it is. They wanted us to forget about that. Just like they wanted us to forget about Kyle, and any other male character of any prominence before who wasn't an embarrassing stereotype. Though speaking of which, the warlocks are virtually all super gay, so that controversial argument rather falls apart with the consideration. To get back to the real matter, though, Cordelia could have avoided most of this, not to mention saved countless people that she is directly responsible for the deaths of, if she had only even played lip service to the concept of equality and comported herself as a decent, even serviceable leader. Instead, she's a massive sexist bully, who openly denigrates others to their faces, throws her title around as if it means anything when she doesn't even do anything others rightly expect of her position, and threatens anyone who even points out the plainest of matters, that she is waning in power because of a new supreme. Because Cordelia fails in every way and never pays attention to the really important things, despite having a vision of disaster and ruin and thus having a good idea of what is coming, she is in one way or another responsible for almost all of the suffering, death, and general misery and unhappiness that happens in this season. If she had paid more attention, instead of being utterly dismissive to the warlocks, she might have found Michael before they did. And maybe, if she'd bothered to relate to the warlocks in any meaningful way, or fulfill her role as a good leader, she could have had their assistance in redeeming Michael and helping to undo the damage Miriam and Constance did with his upbringing. If she'd given any thought at all on how to proceed, she certainly shouldn't have made the same major error of burning people at the stake when it never did any good to anyone in the history of the witch's appearances in American Horror Story. And if she weren't such an idiot, she might have expected Michael to be a little upset at his surrogate mother and two of his mentors being burned alive, instead of assuming that he would take her hand and allow her to shape him into whatever she preferred, which is exactly what Michael has suffered from for all of his life. First Constance, then Miriam. Both women who wanted to be mothers to him, both people who ultimately tried to manipulate him and turn him into what they wanted. Of course, this probably didn't occur to Ryan Murphy because he was too intent on making this a superficially up-with-women story, much like Coven. The problem is that Coven and Apocalypse are neither one of them particularly progressive for women at all. The closest they get is incidentally having characters who are women who have powers. And the major difference between Michael and Cordelia is that Michael isn't a horrible sexist. Despite being twisted and manipulated by both Constance and Miriam, he still cares for both of them. He could have killed Constance on multiple occasions and did not, and he was hurt and confused at being cast out by her. He went out of his way, additionally, to bring Miriam back and to be with her, despite her putting him in dangerous and unenviable positions. And even right after he swore vengeance on Cordelia and her coven, he met Madeline and treated her well and with dignity. Cordelia, on the other hand, can't be bothered to help men just because they're men and views them as lesser, despite that not being how she was in Coven at all. She was a useless sack of shit in Coven, but at least she wasn't a horrible sexist asshole then. Apparently, Ryan Murphy's grasp of feminism has slipped up over the years. Maybe it was all the stupid and crazy for looking up Valerie Solanas. Or more likely, watching the movie I Shot Andy Warhol and completely missing the fucking point. She's completely useless in locating Michael for great expanses of time, despite him having a significant and distinctive power signature and using that power almost constantly. Could she just not be bothered? Because while American Horror Story is nothing if not inconsistent, scrying was a pretty effective power in Coven. And apparently it didn't occur to anybody else to try and find out what he was up to, even though he made seemingly no effort whatsoever to hide himself or his actions. They knew enough to stage and maintain a comprehensive deception over more than a year's time, but somehow they couldn't use their foresight and planning to do anything until after the last minute? But while Michael's out in the wilderness, and civilization too, and right under the witches' noses basically all the time, he has a bunch of surreal experiences. I will admit, all of these may have just been hallucinations, they may have been imagined by Michael, whatever. But if that's true, then why do that all of a sudden after us being able to take everything at face value up to that point? So you have his vision quest being honestly a bizarre melange of equal parts of, well, that's convenient, and what the literal hell. The one part that I think stands out the most is the underwear model angel who, for some reason, says God loves you to Michael. That derails the whole thing. So does God love Michael? If so, why? Does God love everyone else? If he does, why didn't he plan this a little better? You can't just introduce a literal deus ex machina in this character of God, and yet never explain to any degree what part he plays in the whole mess of a drama that this is. And that raises even more questions, in part thanks to Cordelia not knowing when to shut the fuck up earlier in that same episode. Why hasn't anyone told Michael anything or given him any real guidance? Everybody's trying to direct him in some direction or other to suit their own goals, but Michael has received zero guidance from where it should come from, namely Satan. Satan, God the God too for that matter, have a pretty big stake in this playing out. This is supposed to be something foretold for centuries. If we're supposed to believe that Michael hits the point of no return, which we may also assume, due to Cordelia's aforementioned mouth diarrhea, just after the angel appears and then inexplicably suddenly fucks off, then why would you even bother sending a messenger of great power to deliver an unqualified message that was not clear? If you really love Michael, why wouldn't you send an angel who could, I don't know, reason with him? Or explain perhaps why he shouldn't just give up on good and embrace evil? Maybe reassure him that his loved ones are safe and loved because God loves all. But no, we don't get that. So, as a result, we must assume that this God the God who sent the angel is a gigantic asshole that hates everyone and wants to see them suffer, making the angel a liar, and Michael's vision quest of sorts a wholly pointless endeavor. If there was never really any chance of him being redeemed or choosing the right path, then why obliquely present it as a sort of kind of maybe existing but way over there off screen? It's yet another moment where a bad aesthetic choice tremendously hurt the cohesion and coherency of an already flimsy story, especially considering that Cordelia didn't have to mention that she thought Michael was redeemable, but since she did, we were clearly supposed to take that at face value. And speaking of choices that hurt the cohesion and make viewers question the narrative, why send Mallory back to a major event about 100 years previous to change history that no one knows for sure when it may fuck up things, and in any case they would probably never know? The story of Anastasia is one that has no end of fictionalized accounts, and to this day no one still knows the truth of the matter. Wouldn't it make more sense to send her to a less completely unknown event, and a more recent one at that? There are numerous instances in Coven alone where she could have gone back and they have had the actors to film it and change things for the better, or failed in attempting to do so. Because it's indicated that the farther back someone goes, the riskier it is and the more difficult it is to stay there. So why not just go back a few years? It would also have integrated her better into the story and given her more connections with the Coven. Why have Michael go and get Queenie and Madison back when you could have just had Mallory doing it instead and have it actually mean something? For that matter, she could have gone back and saved Kyle before he was killed and resurrected as a patchwork abomination. But speaking of Kyle, as I pointed out in earlier videos, where the fuck is he? There's prime opportunity for narrative contrast in Kyle as a character. Any writer should be able to see that he would have been the perfect foil for Meade, but he was conspicuously absent. Never seen once, despite the actor being available and, as I've mentioned elsewhere, playing more roles than he has ever played in a single production. It's not like they couldn't get him there. Even if they only wanted to throw him away early on like they did with Zoe, it would have at least shown that they remembered Coven and read the scripts to try and get it right. But his conspicuous absence makes it even more obvious that they just didn't have any continuity oversight, or editorial presence whatsoever. You can't just forget about such a major character between seasons, especially when you have another one that is conceptually similar, and would be well served by the contrast in that story. It's very obvious that they didn't want to be bothered to be even as inclusive as they were with Coven, which featured plenty of male characters who were either on our side or at least believable presences, showing admirable diversity in the array of characters we met. In Apocalypse, we might as well have the cult of Sappho versus the Gargarians, which takes us neatly back to the subject of Cordelia being a horrible villain and an objectively terrible person. She even fucks the Warlocks over with her last words when confronting Michael. Not to mention, she references Legion, a demon, or more accurately a mass of demons, which kind of takes away from the impact of her statement, which is already an objectively terrible line. But yeah, great job completely ignoring the Warlocks who were killed because of you, instead of, for even one moment, one last moment that should have been great, entertaining the possibility of equality and unity. Cordelia becomes so upset after the attack on Miss Robichaux's academy that she assaults Madison when Madison points out that they heard that Michael may have the ability to destroy a person's soul. Madison, rightly, takes Delia down a few notches by pointing out that they told her Michael was the Antichrist, and what did she expect? At which moment Cordelia, as usual, just devolves into sobbing and pulling the spotlight on herself. There are several problems here. One of them is, well, Cordelia being an asshole and the villain as usual. If we look back on the dinner scene, which as stated was the last time all the characters are together in peace, Behold expresses concern that the witches are being too flippant when people are going to die. Cordelia casually dismisses his concerns rather than listening to what he or Madison have to say about the topic, which makes her later reaction even more of a douche move. There's even another not-so-clever and not particularly in-character line from Myrtle, ribbing Behold for being responsible for Michael's rise to power, but frankly the witches are as much to blame at that point, especially Cordelia, and especially since she ignores everything everyone else is saying to grab the spotlight yet again. She tells the story of how she brought back Myrtle a couple of years previous, but this is completely irrelevant to the conversation they were having, and in any case it's self-evident. Myrtle is right there at the table. No one asked. Plus, it's rather late in the game and the series to even go into this, especially as it's a very brief scene that only disrupts the flow of the dinner scene. Further, we're supposed to believe that, to quote Cordelia, it nearly killed her. So cutting your hand nearly kills you? Was she already on the way out as a Supreme 2 years ago? Because from the account she gives of the ritual, it wasn't that risky, especially for someone with the Supreme's power levels. Add to that the fact that Myrtle had to make Cordelia promise not to bring her back, and it just seems like resurrection isn't all that dramatic or demanding a thing. Again, if any of this writing crew had actually bothered to watch Coven or read its scripts, they'd probably know better, but it's obvious they didn't. And obvious that Ryan Murphy couldn't be asked to go back and make sure he just went off a half-decade-old memory. But speaking of inconsistency, I'd also like to mention Mallory goes back in time later. Where is the present Mallory? Are there two Mallorys? Are they not supposed to meet each other? Because she is at the school, so if meeting herself is bad, she is really putting herself in danger of that. Again, something not even once considered in the composition of the story, or even touched upon. But getting back to later in the story and the problems inherent with it, why did Cordelia think that wards round the school would keep Michael out? He demonstrated even before going completely off the rails and embracing evil, that he was more powerful than Cordelia by himself. He accomplished a number of things that she either could not do or was simply unwilling to do. There was no real reason why Dinah had to be there, and there's also no reason why she somehow was able to break the wards. Additionally, it's nothing short of idiotic that nobody noticed an oddly dressed woman with an entourage on their front porch performing an elaborate and time-consuming ritual. Nothing is adequately established about voodoo either, in Coven or Apocalypse, that sets it up as being anywhere near as effective as witchcraft, but there's nothing Dinah could do in any case that would set her as the equal to a Supreme. She's essentially a worthless placeholder character who is just filling in for a character that was pretty superfluous even in Coven. And the story sets it up so that Dinah will get tossed casually under a bus for a supposedly exciting return of Marie. But is it exciting? What do we even expect Marie to do at this point? Voodoo has only been shown as more or less irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the witches and even less to do with the Antichrist. Appropriately enough, Maria accomplishes almost absolutely nothing, making her return utterly pointless. Which brings me to my next point that I touched upon before. If they had Jessica Lange for an episode and some assorted change, why not have her resume the role of Fiona? if you have possibly the most beloved and important actor in a whole series back for a brief time, why wouldn't you bring them back in an actually relevant role? Constance's story was done. Fiona could have had a badass moment, actually accomplished something, and even developed Cordelia as a character a bit more just by returning. We could have seen something good in Cordelia by doing something like that, as difficult as it may be for her. Or not, if you see her as the villain I do. But anyway, it makes a lot more sense to bring Fiona back, a woman much more comfortable with her power than Cordelia. Fiona's use of witchcraft and the abilities of witches was effortless, casual, completely a part of her. There is no other witch in the entire cast like that. Fiona used magic and her powers for every aspect of her life and interactions with the world. Marie, it must be said, was never a friend to the witches. She teamed up with Fiona for a very brief period, completely pragmatic reasons. For most of Coven, she worked against the witches, undermined their unity, and tried to kill them on more than one occasion. Just hating Dinah, who is genuinely easy to dislike in an extremely unfortunate role with nothing to do for Adina Porter, is not enough to bring back Marie, as if some kind of a replacement. You're just trading someone who isn't your friend or ally for someone else who isn't your friend or ally. For that matter, Nan pops up again for no reason other than to make not Papa Legba look even creepier. It's not horror, he's just shitty and creepy. She's his favorite, but his favorite what? Non-believer who somehow ended up hanging out with a magical cosplayer horribly misrepresenting the being he's supposed to be? Just saying, I'm sure voodoo devotees are probably not too happy at someone being assumed into the voodoo afterlife as a major figure when that person had nothing to do with voodoo when she was alive. Back to the matter of Cordelia's insanity, though. With her lacking protections on the school, why exactly is it that there was no plan in case the school was attacked? It was not only expressed that it was a possibility and that multiple people were concerned. Cordelia knows by that point that her powers are fading. She's brought it up herself on more than one occasion. It's clear that, as much as witchcraft is shown to be some danger to Michael, Cordelia is not powerful enough to stop him alone. And several of them do manage to escape to Misty's shack. Cordelia even goes back and forth, but in Coven it's stated that teleportation is extremely dangerous, especially over long distances. It's even shown to be dangerous, and poor use of the power results in death. Misty doesn't just live in a shack at the edge of downtown. The school is situated quite some way from the swamp, so I can hand-wave one part or the other. If we had to hand-wave anything, I'd say it's fair to just casually regard the teleportation as safe enough, as long as you know the destination well. If we take that at face value, then why in the living fuck did Cordelia not have an escape plan for everyone at the school? Why did people stay behind when they knew they were sure to be killed or worse? Why didn't Cordelia get everyone teleported to Misty's shack? Michael and his allies seem to be completely unaware somehow of Misty's shack's existence, despite them knowing that Misty exists, and despite them knowing enough about Misty to find out virtually everything else. It's not exactly a major puzzler. In Coven, Misty was locally famous. It's not like they didn't know her name, to say nothing of knowing a huge amount about her soul since Michael rescued her from hell itself. On this same track, how exactly did Cordelia's plan with Mallory and Coco even work? Putting spells on them to make them forget is one thing, but creating a whole new identity, that really is a miracle. Coco's parents were responsible for securing her place in Outpost 3. It's not like they weren't ridiculously wealthy to be able to afford that, or like they weren't somehow at least decently well known. That much was established more than adequately. So how is it that Michael had no idea who Mallory and Coco were? He had plenty of time to figure that out. They attended the school for quite some time. It should have been a complete giveaway when the St. Pierre Vanderbilts turned up on the list of people cleared for Outpost 3, to say nothing of the fact that Meade, if we take her robot resurrection at face value, had encountered both Coco and Mallory before her human form's death. Meade in robot form seems to have retained her memory to a remarkable extent. Why then wouldn't she remember, at the very least, the witch primarily responsible for her death? The Meadbot seems to have an awareness and its own personality, but Mutt and Jeff commandeer and speak through it more than once. Later on, however, they're either long dead or in no position to do that any longer, so we can assume that the Mead robot actually is sentient and self-aware. If she is, then why doesn't she remember at least stretches of blackouts where she was being puppeted by Mutt and Jeff? Why wouldn't she mention this to Michael, whom she seems to care for above every other person in the world? And just an incidental curiosity here, why does Miriam Mead adopt John Henry Moore's fashion sense after killing him? Was this supposed to be some kind of Highlander thing? It makes absolutely no sense, but for some reason Mead adopts his entire aesthetic down to the hairstyle. It's a turning point for her character, but it also seems very weird as a visual choice. What exactly were they trying to say with that? In any case, Cordelia's plan is absolutely one of the stupidest plans that has ever existed, and it makes no sense unless you're an idiot, which in Cordelia's case we see to be true on numerous occasions. She is the worst at strategic thought. She ignores her allies attempting to inform her. She downplays serious dangers, and despite what she says, she seems to care only about herself, not about the witches she is supposed to lead and protect. The one time she actually has a good idea of having the coven perform this sacred taking and giving her life for the benefit of all other witches, she presents it to the one person she knows will only try and discourage her from it. It's not Myrtle's fault, and it is in character, remarkably and uncommonly, I'm sad to note for Apocalypse, for her to say and do exactly what she does. And of course Cordelia knew that much. She knew that if she went to Myrtle, Myrtle would stop her even suggesting it. The rest of the time, though, Cordelia only comes up with the worst ideas ever. That's why we're supposed to have an actual witches' council, which we don't in the course of Apocalypse. They're referenced, but they don't actually exist. If we're supposed to believe that the council consists of Cordelia, Myrtle, and Zoe, then there are more problems with that lineup being the council than I have time to go into. But in short order, conflict of interest raises too many questions and concerns, and nowhere near experienced or intelligent enough, and other than Myrtle, none of them at all contributes to any of the plans. It's mostly just Cordelia acting unilaterally and doing whatever the fuck she wants or thinks is smart at the moment. Furthermore, I don't know if we're supposed to believe it. At the point in the series where it occurs, I don't think so. But Cordelia tells Michael that he can't bring her back because Cordelia has magically hidden Mead's soul. First off, something everyone at this point should remember is the fact that Michael performed not only resurrections, but extracting people from hell. He also managed to free Queenie, which Cordelia could not do. She didn't have the power to do that. So exactly how in the name of the lizard god is Cordelia sealing people's souls away to prevent their resurrections? It's not only ludicrous to attempt to make us believe that she's capable of this, but it really smacks of disorganized, poor writing that nothing even remotely like this is ever indicated before or after. If it were that straightforward, then why wouldn't Myrtle have her do that in Coven? And how is it that, despite her claims, Mead seems to be fully returned to her former self after we know Mutt and Jeff are long dead? Nothing is even consistent between the episodes. If we just look at it, even casually, let's go over this. Mead was a Satanist who had given her soul to Satan. Given the possibilities we know about in the series universe, she went to hell. Cordelia is saying that she somehow hid Mead's soul away in a realm ruled absolutely by Michael's father, in which Michael earlier quickly and effortlessly arranged for Misty's liberation, to say nothing of simply going in and springing Madison. Nice trick for sure. If we're supposed to believe Cordelia, she's more powerful than God. But it falls apart instantly if you look at it, so she's either lying intentionally or greatly overestimating her abilities. Moving on to another utter nadir delivered to us by Apocalypse, Mutt and Jeff are the worst part of the whole series, and that's saying something. Their names, their looks, basically everything about them demolishes the story and makes the narrative take a particularly wretched turn. Supposedly, the whole idea of the Apocalypse is orchestrated by them down to the stupid outposts idea. This not only marginalizes Michael at a late point in the series, but it also makes everything that came before, most especially all the time we spent with Outpost 3 at the start of the series, seem completely pointless and utterly irrelevant to anything. As I stated before, nearly the first half of the series and most of the characters who appear in it are just wasting time until the real protagonists, the witches, show up. And most of the characters introduced at first either never meet the witches or have very little to do with them at all. Pointless, wasted time. But it's especially regrettable that we have Mutt and Jeff around at all, much less that they seem to have the Apocalypse planned out while Michael knows nothing about what he's really supposed to be doing here. The closest he gets to guidance is the Omen movies, which would be funny if it weren't so sad. Sad mainly because the Omen films are all written more solidly than American Horror Story, and despite being out of date are also more relevant than American Horror Story, as well as better plotted in a cohesive narrative. Shouldn't Michael know or be informed of how to accomplish his purpose on Earth? Were we just supposed to kind of assume that Satan didn't know and God wasn't telling? If so, why is it that mystic Satanists pop out of the woodwork in Apocalypse? Seriously, you can't turn around without bumping into one in the American Horror Story universe. And yet, God sends an angel that can't deliver a more valuable message than ILUXOXO God. So essentially more pointless wasted time. We spend so much of the series with the literally unbelievably populist mystic Satanists, none of which seem to actually understand the reality of the situation, yet there's no one who actually pitches in from the God side of things. It's ridiculously convenient that anything happens at all, and Michael gets anywhere at all in the story, or the world for that matter, but it's even more so that no one from the other side of the fight ever turns up. How hard would it have been to have someone trying to redeem Michael from the start, who believed in him and wanted to share the love of God with him, who had perhaps even been sent by God to do that? I mean, let's face it, the situation wasn't as straightforward as we thought, since at the end there's another Antichrist kid. Somehow. It's an obvious attempt at a twist and a hook at the same time, and it's badly written and inconsistent with even itself. Did you guys forget about the murder house thing that had its own episode and, season? But even that aside, it's incredibly conspicuous that Michael keeps constantly attracting a very rare, specific type of Satanist, but he never attracts any attention from anyone other than the witches who might have other ideas about him. He is never targeted for being the Antichrist by any group. The Omen series of films and even the Damien adaptation for television incorporated those elements prominently, and I think it was wise that they did. The Damien series particularly made the Antichrist a conflicted figure who was, more often than not, simply caught in the crossfire between two warring sides out to do the same fundamental thing. Like Kyle, God's forces were very conspicuous by their absence, and Underwear Angel didn't make that better. But to touch on the whole question of Satanism for a moment, that's another thing the show got very, very, very wrong. It's always a problem to fictionalize real-life people, and it's something I disagree strongly with. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If you can't bring something new to the examination of a real person that actually existed, please, don't disgrace the memory of them or those around him, or even those who suffered because of them, in the case of like a serial killer, by fictionalizing them into something else. Especially not the cartoon that popped up in Apocalypse. Anton LaVey largely created Satanism as a tongue-in-cheek response to the preponderance of cults and the like during the 60s and 70s. It was outfitted with diabolical window dressing, but it was always more of a secular subversion of religion. Satanism was largely an answer to the rise of the megachurch, and its main point was to encourage people to empower themselves. Do you know what the main tenets of Satanism are? Let me sum them up for you. Don't be an idiot. Don't be a douchebag to other people. Don't let other people be a douchebag to you. That's basically it in a nutshell. Satanists don't sit around thinking of ways to be cartoon evil. To them, perhaps the greatest evil a person can be is willfully stupid, and they tend not to tolerate that. They are not, I must be clear, people who just try to do the opposite of Christians in any way aside from the aforementioned window dressing, which is mainly to fuck with people who become obsessed with the staging more than the actual spiritual beliefs. Satanists are, more often than not, perfectly nice people, so it's kind of incredibly annoying that we see them portrayed all aspirants for the role of Snidely Whiplash. The only people who could call themselves Satanists who actually believe in the Antichrist, or even the devil for that matter, are theistic Satanists, and those are very rare indeed. Even rarer to find one who actually does believe in the Antichrist and so forth. That's even more of a niche. So for Michael to somehow constantly stumble upon these very rare Satanists, or to have them stumble upon him constantly, is more than a little hard to believe. Powers were similarly inconsistent in Apocalypse, but this is nothing new. Cordelia can cause the Meadbot to overload and explode with one word. One. She doesn't do this earlier. Why exactly? Was she waiting to read through fun magic to do with robots? She could have saved the lives of everyone at her school and avoided all of her drama fit pitching if she'd done that. But maybe I've answered my own question. If she prevented the massacre she directly caused with her actions and words, then she couldn't be the center of attention while she whined and cried about all the people she's responsible for the deaths of. Similarly, Myrtle is demonstrated as being able to set someone on fire with a single word. So why was this never turned on Michael, or anyone else for that matter, before now? We know the witches can command the elements, which we at least see consistently through Coven and Apocalypse, but Apocalypse introduces parts that make it unclear if every witch can command every element. Fair enough, but if there are people who can effortlessly manifest an element on demand, why didn't anyone think to use that against their foes at all? Every time we see the witches fight, it's hamstrung by stupidity and ineptitude, because we see them doing genuinely useful things only when it doesn't matter. And it makes it even worse that Myrtle burning Brock alive distracts Madison, which means that Michael can get past her, which causes Cordelia's group to be put in imminent danger. Again. And speaking of people with tremendous power who seem only to use it when it doesn't matter unless they're currently being the deus ex machina, Mallory has no personality other than I don't want Cordelia to die because of me. She has little material and is, much like Dinah, used as a deus ex machina that has very little real bearing on the plot. It's not because Billie Lourd is a bad actress, she's just given so much nothing to do that she often sits around looking very bored in almost every scene she's in. Mallory exhibits none of the other powers to that point, but when they go into the old-timey film clip, which they do only a couple of times, arbitrarily and never again, they list her bringing back John Henry Moore as her seventh test. Tempus infinitum, which is basically what she's employing to undo the injuries, is not one of the seven wonders, and is explicitly stated as something they don't believe exists until she shows the gift. Similarly, Coco never gets development. She never gets time to become a real person, and the Coco that we sort of get to know in the first 3 episodes is just a fake personality. In Flashback World, all she serves as is the punchline for decidedly unfunny jokes, or the punching bag for anyone who wants to manipulate her. She has no agency, no depth, and she's treated by the script as the village idiot, despite her pointing out things that are very clearly true that no one else seems to notice or care about. She suddenly, out of nowhere, is willing to do whatever is asked of her for the Coven. But what have the Coven even done for her? We see her change from being dismissive of her own admittedly fairly niche powers, level 1, Zoe level, to being excited that her powers might not always be so lame. That isn't really development. That's just the script moving her along to serve whatever role it wants her to, whether or not it suits her. When you completely overwrite a person's personality for the sake of your needs as a scriptwriter, there's something wrong there. Coco never has a moment where she shows that her danger sense is useful. In fact, Coco never manages to be useful at any point. It's always someone else around her who actually manages it, but it's never directly her. It's a shame, too, because the character is well acted and amusing. She just never gets to do anything, much like Mallory, Dinah, and pretty much every other character newly introduced in Apocalypse. I was glad to see familiar-ish characters from Coven, but did they have to be handled so clumsily? It would have been far more interesting if they had come back the way they were in Coven and had some things to say about how Cordelia was running things. It would have been great to see Dinah actually have a story and some personality rather than just being a placeholder to remind us of Angela Bassett vaguely. It wouldn't be anything new to have the witches essentially scatter to the winds and occasionally clash with each other. They did that in Coven throughout it. It's important to note, and I want you to remember this, most of the characters in Coven were not friends with each other. They tolerated each other and worked with each other sometimes, but to call them a functional Coven was really overstating their unity. They worked together only when it suited them and their personal goals. That's also largely why they never managed to take the power from Fiona. They didn't work well together, and there was no potential Supreme who could manage to command the position. Wouldn't it have been far more interesting to set it in New Orleans again and have Dinah actually take a real role, wrestling with filling the tremendous shoes her predecessor left? And to have the younger witches conflicted more than ever whether to fall in with Cordelia or to question her leadership, since she's pretty objectively a poor leader and has always been one? Just think! Zoe could have actually developed a personality of her own. Kyle could have had his feelings and thoughts explored in a unique role as one of only a very few people privy to this still secret world. Madison could have struggled against feelings of antipathy and resentment for Cordelia being so irresponsible and cruel, not to mention stealing her idea, but knowing that the alternative would be disastrous. For the moment, the enemy of an enemy might have to serve as a friend. That was a theme running throughout Coven. I'm not saying it would have been brilliant. This is Ryan Murphy, after all, but it would have certainly been better than what we got, with the witches from Coven essentially serving as background characters, filler characters, who only serve as a perfunctory role in the plot and a body count when they need it. Did we need Coco or Mallory? As fond as I am of the actresses that played them, they added basically nothing to the story and instead took away from the other characters who could have used the attention, desperately. When you expand a group, you're committing to the writing and development for these characters. If you don't have anything for them to do, don't invent new characters to sit in the background and do nothing. And I'm not going to just read the witches for filth and not the warlocks, so don't worry about that. What sense does the warlocks level system even fucking make? If level 3 is the level of all the highest level warlocks, a level wherein someone can provide instruction to students at an official institution, we can call that Grand Master level, let's just say. So level 1 is basic bitch, like Zoe and Coven level. Level 1 warlocks can do things, just not much and not very effectively most of the time. This makes their system seem rather questionable, considering that's a lot like having a dojo where you have a white belt, a yellow belt, and a black belt, and then the only other level is Iron Fist. What's the point? Ariel Augustus seems, from the start of our acquaintance with him, fixated on hierarchy. He's a Grand Chancellor, but that doesn't mean anything because we're given no context. Why shouldn't he be the Supreme Warlock? I mean, aside from because Ryan Murphy doesn't understand how to write dynamic characters. But Fiona was arguably a tremendous antagonist, or presented as such, all throughout Coven. She had her own goals and motives that often did not match the other witches, but she was compelling and had a lot of levels to her. Why couldn't we have Ariel be as three-dimensional a character as the actor tried to convey? Sure, the whole male versus female fight is inane and incredibly annoying, as well as rendered utterly nonsensical by the presence of Leslie Jordan in Coven alone, but if it were written in a compelling way, it could have been entertaining for a little while. The actors certainly were pouring themselves into their roles as much as they could with the lacking material. If you have performed the 7 wonders, that does not necessarily make you the Supreme. If you are the Supreme, however, you can be assumed to be able to perform the 7 wonders. The Supreme was established in Coven as being an extremely powerful witch capable of using all witch powers and capable of performing feats that others could not accomplish. It was also indicated by the development of characters through the story in Coven and Apocalypse that witches could learn to do things that were outside of the 7 abilities considered essential to occupy the position of Supreme. Of course, everything went down the crapper in the last episode of Coven, and for some reason basically everyone was able to accomplish most of the 7 wonders. See elsewhere for some of my problems with and commentary on that, but in any case, despite the dramatic name, the 7 wonders are basically just a simple competency test for someone to occupy the chiefest position amongst witches. Only one of the tests is particularly dangerous, and it's mainly dangerous because it apparently must be administered in the stupidest way possible at the time of the test. So why is it that the warlocks only have 3 tests? They seem to think very poorly of themselves, but they also don't, it must be pointed out, seem to ever actually challenge themselves. As I said in my other video, the warlocks each individually show, minus maybe Baldwin, who barely manages to be sentient, more ability than most of the witches in the entirety of Coven. And with everything else that's dumped unceremoniously on our doorstep to take at face value, we get witches doing whatever the script needs at the moment, whether or not it's even in their wheelhouse. See also Zoe, who has gone from as nearly inanimate as Baldwin in Coven to a Swiss Army knife of witchcraft in Apocalypse. Still doesn't have a personality, though. That must be the 8th wonder. The many massive inconsistencies are likely just results from bad writing in an attempt to introduce a twist at the 11th hour in Coven, continued in the American horror story tradition of whatever the opposite of excellence is in Apocalypse. But back to the warlocks. Ariel could have been like Fiona, but he wasn't given enough development. John Henry Moore comes off like a douchebag, consistently presented by the script as if we're supposed to like him or find him appealing, but we don't. The closest he gets is when he's about to be murdered, because the scriptwriter knew he needed to appeal so we would actually give a fuck that he's killed. Since he also comes back almost instantly, we don't care that much, and it doesn't change the fact that he's had his head up his own ass so far that it was nothing short of spectacular he never found Narnia. He goes out of his way to be a total twat to everyone around him, but especially Michael, and of course the script dictates that he was right. But never once does he manage to be likable. Which is a shame, because the actor is genuinely likable, and a lot better than this production allows him to be. Considering he's supposed to be one of 3 major figures leading the Hawthorne Academy, and he feels free to just quit regularly and fuck off to do whatever he wants, he's not particularly likable from the start. He has a too-cool-for-school way of behaving, and he clearly sees himself as above the others, judging by his consistently dismissive way of addressing Behold. I don't include Baldwin in here because, let's face it, Baldwin is only barely a character. But these are almost all just placeholders for us as the audience to be given permission to hate. And the biggest problem here is, when you look at their motivations, one clearly outshows the other. Look at Cordelia. Yes, again. She hates Ariel Augustus first and foremost because he's a man with any power or position, who has the audacity to question her despite the fact that literally everyone can recognize her shortcomings as supreme. Ariel Augustus hates Cordelia first and foremost because he and the rest of the warlocks have been repeatedly and consistently treated as, and I quote, second-class citizens, even to the point where her irresponsible actions cause millions of dollars in property damage and endanger the lives of numerous children, as well as the adults around them. Cordelia has no real reason to treat Ariel or the other warlocks the way she does, but Ariel, we find, has a lot of compelling reasons to dislike Cordelia and all her coven, since it can be assumed that they're okay with her actions because they're continuing to support her. The script basically has to turn Ariel into a mustache-twirling supervillain in an attempt to get the audience to forget that he has valid grievances which set him against Cordelia in the first place. And here's the thing. Just because someone is against the assumed protagonist, that may make them antagonistic, but it doesn't have to mean that they're wrong. And it also doesn't necessarily mean that they are antagonists. It just takes more nuance and subtlety in writing than clearly Murphy's team are able to give. And it's not because it's beyond them. The first 2 seasons of American Horror Story were highly compelling character studies, and a recurring theme with especially Asylum was one of a woman's nightmare, of having agency taken away and being at the mercy of a cruel man, or even another woman. It also had much more nuanced villains such as Sister Jude, another woman, but one who was not kind to other women. She wasn't just some irredeemable bad guy, though. She was played with uncommon levels of nuance and detail to her, which is what we should have had in terms of writing with Ariel. It's primarily the compelling performance by the actor that is given any depth at all, and with the utter terribleness of the script, it's a miracle if anyone can get out those lines without sounding patently ludicrous. Wouldn't it have been much more interesting, not to mention less embarrassing to anybody that knows what Satanism is about, to have Sandra Bernhard as a scenery-chewing, hilarious warlock? Sure, it would have required writing more nuance to Ariel's resentment of Cordelia, and probably vice versa, but actually putting forth any effort at all would surely have improved the story. All it takes is 1 or 2 uncommon people on any side in a story to convey a kind of shorthand that at least indicates a mindfulness of trying for diversity. All it takes is that minimum amount of effort which somehow seems to be completely beyond Apocalypse to do. We don't even see Myrtle's strange bodyguards more than once in the whole series. But I will give Cordelia this. The one thing she does right is just basically undoing a flagrant and stupid error she made previously, and that's bringing Myrtle back. The last episode of Coven was a giant clusterfuck, and Myrtle getting ridden out was one of the many examples of incredibly bad writing in a TV hour. So really, even this doesn't get Cordelia a net positive impact on the world. She's just fixing something she herself fucked up needlessly. She could have easily just told Myrtle that she wouldn't do that and she needed Myrtle around, thereby eliminating the need for all the melodrama she goes through to get her back. It at least made Cordelia seem a little more human, which was nice, but it also meant that she was basically just waiting for a good enough reason to do it, which isn't nice. So Myrtle can just chill in whatever afterlife until Cordelia's ready to yank her back? Classy. Similarly classy as Mallory's "I'll get to it later" attitude about bringing Madison back from hell. What a pair of assholes. They really deserve each other. Incidentally, demons are legendary for not fighting with each other more than otherwise, but even outside of that, it's still utterly ludicrous. If Mallory gained that much sway in the other worlds, why didn't she just get all the witches back that weren't currently around? She seemed awfully sure she could just waltz into hell and grab Madison, but like an asshole decided for no good reason to make her wait. After Madison worked her ass off thanklessly and even gave her life to save Mallory's, not mention putting herself directly in danger constantly for Mallory. But back to Myrtle. Myrtle is the Gandalf, which is to say that she's the hyper-capable member of the group that actually accomplishes things unlike virtually anyone else but Madison. Naturally, one of the many problems with the season and its story is that she cleans house when she actually does act, but most of the time it's other people who are doing things, whether or not they're the most capable or right choice for the task. This also ends up making most of the coven effectively extraneous. The best example of this is probably Misty, who inexplicably was regarded as super difficult to resurrect despite it being a major plot point in Coven that she could resurrect herself even while dead. Pro tip, guys, just because Cordelia fucked it up or couldn't do something doesn't mean nobody else can. especially when it's, a major part of the character that Misty is able to resurrect herself. But when she's finally brought back to the Coven, what does she do? Nothing! Absolutely nothing! You so stupid! All Misty is there for is to add a humanizing element to Cordelia, which does not work, and to give Stevie Nicks a hook to appear again, unfortunately. Neither of these things add to the story or the characters, and ultimately Misty's presence is worthless. It goes without saying that Stevie Nicks' presence is even more worthless than Misty's, because at least Misty's played by an actor and the character is likable. Even when Misty gets brought back, inexplicably, in the progressively worse and worse ending of the final episode, not only are her lines awkward and terrible, along with everybody else's, but they also don't make sense. Any more than they did in the earlier episode. Guys, watch your own damn show, or at least look over your scripts. Misty Day was not into the Coven. She said in Coven that she was looking for her tribe, and she also said, regarding the Miss Robichaux's Coven, this ain't it. She was constantly trying to get away from them and get out of what they were doing. She even said explicitly that she had no interest in being the Supreme and didn't want to do what they were doing. It's only through the miracle of abjectly terrible writing in the very last episode that they even tricked her into doing the Seven Wonders. She and Cordelia knew each other for an extremely short amount of time to be acting like they're old pals here. And what's worse, they make that same mistake twice during Apocalypse. And it's worse at the end when you think that Ryan Murphy writing the episode would give it more consistency with previous continuity. Ha! He appears to have about as good a memory as a fruit fly, or perhaps a goldfish if we're being generous. They even try to throw in Misty having some kind of evil detection powers and paint her as a traumatized innocent. Fair enough, since she spent years in hell and Cordelia didn't even try to spring her again after becoming the Supreme, which is something nobody really mentions. Cordelia failed to save her during the Descensum test, but she wasn't the Supreme then. So we can only assume that, after that, she just didn't try at all afterwards. Despite the fact that as the Supreme, she should be able to perform Descensum and get other people out of danger in their own personal hell with little effort. That should be something the Supreme does while proctoring the test of the Seven Wonders, in fact. Which, again, is something never mentioned because we're supposed to believe that not passing a test to do one thing needlessly risky is worth dying over. What's responsibility, precious? If you think otherwise, look at Madison for a good example. Mallory states with no doubt whatsoever that she can get Madison back from hell easily. But she's just letting her wait because Mallory, by the end, has inherited Cordelia's power of being a giant asshole. Even aside from Mallory, it's stated explicitly that everyone else in the Coven knew Madison was dead, they just chose to do nothing about it, even though they easily could have. Madison and Misty were in the exact same situations, and yet neither one was rescued until Michael came along and did it. Some Supreme Cordelia is. She leaves both the one genuine ally, as Misty was never a student at the Academy, and the one genuinely intelligent person at Robichaux's in hell, while she does a whole lot of nothing for 2+ years despite knowing that she'll need all the help she can get. It's only through Madison's indulgence that Cordelia even gains her as an ally. Basically because the script said so, and Misty asserts that she can't fight because she spent too long in hell. I wonder whose fault that was. If Cordelia could have shifted that ass of hers sooner, maybe when she was resurrecting other people missing from the Coven, maybe then she could have prepared the Coven adequately for the danger she foresaw, instead of having everyone back 5 minutes before the fucking apocalypse. It's endlessly and needlessly frustrating, and it makes it seem like everything Madison accomplished, not to mention Misty's entire presence in the series, completely pointless. Not that Misty is in the series much. Her newly upgraded Shaq features more prominently in the series than she does, since she just fucks off immediately following her first appearance and is never seen again until the end. Even Myrtle ends up being tossed under the plot bus a time or two, with her doing things completely unsuited to her character, like being horribly unprofessionally sexist for a minute early on because they needed someone to blame that wasn't Cordelia, despite the fact that she's totally to blame as the Supreme for encouraging that attitude and promoting it herself. She's setting a bad example, and she should be held responsible and accountable because that's what comes with power. Responsibility! But most of what Myrtle does is great and fun, especially in the finale, though part of the major problem with the majority of the season being a back-built story is that characters have to be obstacles from time to time because Ryan Murphy and company don't know how to write a naturally unfolding story. At times, characters are required to stand in the way of anything happening, or they take unacceptably lengthy tangents almost entirely because Murphy and his writing staff don't know how else to artificially protract the story. And now, speaking from a very personal place, I just want to talk about something I found especially of questionable taste. In an inordinately well-done scene between Ariel and Michael, Ariel tells him about how Cordelia's outing of the magical community brought out hate and bigotry that literally burned down their school with Molotov cocktail. Cordelia never at any time shows regret or apology for what she did, nor did she show any real consideration of collateral damage before doing it in Coven. As I said before many times, she's motivated by fear herself and tends to be exactly the scared, vulnerable person she's accused of being, even though we're supposed to think otherwise as the audience. She bullies everyone into going along with her and tries to strong-arm anyone that doesn't. She never, at any point, tries to hide her bigoted opinions or even make them less obvious since, you might want to do that if you're in a supreme executive position of power, unless you're an idiot. Which is something that Ryan Murphy should probably know very well, both after writing Cult and living in the United States for the past 4 years. The thing is, Ariel, until his writing goes off the rails and turns him into Snidely Whiplash, is looking out for what he sees as his people. Maybe before he was just an instructor, or a Grand Chancellor or whatever, and helping to run the school, which I should point out is far more than Cordelia did in Coven, and he does a far better job. Witches were dwindling in Coven. It was one of the major plot points. Yes, they were being hunted by the witch hunters, which she incidentally enabled, but they were also not given hardly any guidance or care by Cordelia, and Miss Robichaud's academy was only nominally a school. To contrast, the Hawthorne School for Exceptional Young Men is actually a school. Lessons are seen, organized, and well attended. The personnel are knowledgeable and clearly dedicated to their tasks, even despite a little silly low-level soap opera drama between them. They come off as a varied group, far more diverse than the witches, and their personalities more complementary. It's only through the clunky writing that we have things happen to cast them as villains, or at least as people who aren't working with the supposed heroes of the piece. We have Ariel going from a victim of a hate crime and completely unethical, unprofessional discrimination by someone in power to a cardboard cutout of a villain. And of course he's dealt with almost instantly because we can't have someone around for long enough for the audience to consider maybe, just maybe, he wasn't being all that outrageous. The stupid magic thing that only affects one's sex plot device aside, Ariel was doing what he felt would protect his people, who had been horribly and detrimentally affected by Cordelia, who repeatedly showed no remorse for her poor decision-making skills. And it's 100% Cordelia's fault. She's a bad Supreme and constantly just fumbles through every decision, interaction, and scene in general. She made a villain for herself out of Ariel. She put so many more people in danger when it was frankly a stupid idea to go public with witches in the first place. Then, when she could have subsequently cultivated a healthy, positive relationship with the Warlocks and every other group in the magical community, she acted like a super extra asshole and went out of her way to be rude to them quite undeservedly. And let me remind you, because Apocalypse clearly wants us not to remember this, Cordelia tried on multiple occasions to kill her mother, the Supreme at the time, and even conspired with multiple other people she made complicit in her attempts. Yet she was rewarded narratively and completely undeservedly, and lashes out to an extreme degree at anyone that even implies she may be waning in power. Which she is, and she knows she is, and she mentions that she is on multiple occasions. The thing is, I know how it feels to be a part of an oppressed minority, and I also know how it feels to have someone get a little bit of some kind of power or influence and for them to show how undeserving they are of it. I have been discriminated against due to virtually every trait I have, whether it's inborn or a life choice. I have been discriminated against because of my biological sex. I have been discriminated against because of my orientation. I have been discriminated against because of my ethnicity. I have been discriminated against because of my beliefs and dietary restrictions. In short, I know a thing or two about discrimination, and I know the one thing you don't do when you want a character to be sympathetic is this. You don't make them a huge fucking bigot. Even Fiona in Coven said very specifically and very clearly, if there's one thing she hates, it's a racist. There were many occasions where Fiona showed herself to be a surprisingly decent person. Cordelia doesn't have that. Ever. Ariel and his co-conspirators were going too far by the end. But that's mainly because the writers realized they had made the characters dangerously sympathetic to the audience, so they needed to cast them as supervillains and not just antagonists or anti-heroes. Regardless, can I really blame them for feeling like they had to go to this extent for any degree of positive change? Not really. Cordelia and her coven have only ever encouraged antipathy towards them. She never did a single thing to help them, but more than that, she actively did them harm, belittled them, and refused to do the duty she was obliged to do as the Supreme on multiple occasions. Meanwhile, you had these warlocks, who probably had to figure out a lot themselves, treated as second-class citizens, and I'm quoting from the show here, and having a large amount of untrained young people under their protection who clearly were shown no sympathy or care by the one person supposed to lead and guide them. She had, from the start of her reign as Supreme, shown nothing but a lack of consideration at best for them, but it really was more contempt through neglect. She clearly considered their lives and safety worthless, and far less precious to her than going down in history and being the big leader. When you have to fend for yourself all your life, and you are constantly shown that putting trust in others is a mistake, when you are repeatedly and consistently abused by people in whom authority is vested, when your life is endangered simply by existing or doing simple things any other person could do without fear. Yeah, sometimes you might do something dramatic, especially in a fictional show's story, where you can't turn around without bumping into a fucking diva. I have more than adequately outlined how Cordelia made all of her own problems and kept failing to solve them or even address them. But more than that, I want to convey that the warlocks really didn't deserve what was done to them. They were treated like shit by the narrative, even though what they did was not consistent with what people said about them, and sometimes what they said about themselves. It's disturbing to me that a gay man writing a story could be so horribly ignorant of his own people's suffering, and yet presume to write about other people's suffering in such a clumsy, offensive way. He did the same thing in Coven, and it was absolutely one of the most disgusting things I'd ever seen on television up to that point. I commented on it as such in my now very long ago Coven review. But to do what he did with the warlocks in Apocalypse was just flagrant disregard for real suffering, and it's not any more acceptable there than it was in Coven. It makes him come off, probably appropriately, like a spoiled asshole who never actually faced any real oppression at all. He's the Hollywood gay, the kind that's got his contacts and his money and never has to worry about someone outing him and destroying his career, or deciding he doesn't need to live because of who he loves or how he likes to have fun in his private life. And that really makes me not want to support American Horror Story or any of Murphy's other just as terrible projects. Sure, you cast a bunch of gays, you have a bunch of people play gay that gay audiences want to see, you ride the homo trends and the queer waves, but that doesn't mean you're helping the gay community, and it really doesn't mean that you know anything about this community you clearly don't understand. Just throwing in gayness and queerness and everything else doesn't make a show progressive, any more than just having a capable female lead makes it progressive. You have to follow through with the actual writing. There exists a long history of coded queer characters who weren't overtly open as queer, for whatever reason at the time, but who are played that way or obviously are that way regardless of anything else. There have been numerous gay characters cast as villains, and similarly villains played as coded gay. Part of this whole way of doing things is that it can give such characters motivation for what they do. If you're oppressed and can't live your life the way you choose in the larger world, you're very likely to become disenfranchised and see the mainstream as oppressive, which it can certainly be and often is. Coded gay villains are often only the bad guy because the assumed hero of the piece represents all the mainstream values that are straight in every sense of the word. But really, we shouldn't be coding gay villains still. And in Apocalypse, whether they're meant to be or not, the warlocks are basically a big old bunch of queens. They're cast as coded gay villains, and some of them are treated as complete villains outright, because Murphy and his writing team do not understand and are not able to employ nuance to any notable degree. I'm not saying that gay characters can never or should never be villains. What I am saying is that it's not only too early to really do that if you can't do it well, but also if you're setting an example by being out and proud and incorporating lots of queer elements in your work, you can't set an example that lets less enlightened types use it as an excuse. Because there will be no end of the idiots that see something like American Horror Story and say, well, if the gays do it to their own, we can do it. It's like giving them permission to take victims of systematic oppression and turn them into mustache-twirling bad guys, which is, in fact, the opposite of progress in representation. The treatment of the warlocks is especially execrable considering it was done by someone who should know better. Even putting the very real matter of oppression aside, a huge amount of the audience for American Horror Story wanted to see warlocks. They wanted to see male witches. It was something that awakened and inspired the imagination. To treat them like this is yet another of the many examples of Murphy giving the audience what he thought would satisfy them, but which really only showed that he hadn't been listening. He never gives, in American Horror Story, what the audience wants, but he comes close enough to show that he sees what the fans are asking for. He just never pays enough attention to get it right, and he doesn't have the writing skill to present any of it in a way that's actually good. Thank you for listening. Again, if you like what I do, please follow me on social media, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me. See you next time. You're welcome. Bye.